Welcome to Out of the Blank.
Welcome to another episode of Out of the Blank podcast. It's a pleasure to have you on, Alan. Would you like to introduce yourself to everyone out there listening?
Well, I thought you would do it for a change.
You got to tell us a little bit about yourself. Nobody can tell us better than you.
Okay, that's probably true. The name is Alan Hornblum. I have a fairly diverse background. I've spent time working in various capacities of the criminal justice system, spent years working in the Philly prisons. Years later, I was on the State Crime Commission investigating organized crime and public corruption, was also chief of staff of the Philadelphia Sheriff's Office. I've taught at Temple University for many years, lectured at many different colleges, including Brown and Princeton and Columbia, Penn State, Villanova, Washington University of St. Louis. Have done a good bit of writing of articles, mostly long form journalism and books. Acres of Skin is arguably the best known one. Some people, they get excited, they hear the title Acres of Skin, they think it's a pornography book, but it's nothing like that. It's really the history of using prisoners as guinea pigs for medical experiments. I've done two other books dealing with human experimentation. They would be Sentenced to Science and Against Their Will, which is a pretty sad story of the history of using institutionalized children as medical guinea pigs. But I've also written about organized crime. I've written about sports. Bill Tilden, a great tennis player, arguably the Babe Ruth of tennis that very few Americans know of today, unfortunately. I've also written on Harry Gold, who was the real James Bond. He was the individual who gave the secrets of the atomic bomb to the Soviets. And I have a few others out there dealing with an array of topics. So my books and my interests move in different directions at different times. And then if there's no book to educate me on it, I end up doing a book myself. So I'm not necessarily a specialist in any one area, although some people peg me that way. So I do a deep dive in topics that interest me at a certain time. And that's how I've made it to Robbie's platform here.
Can I ask how you got interested or just found out about medical experimentation, especially in prisons? Acres of Skin, like I said, I just watched your film. It illuminated a couple of things for me as well, too. But these are heavy topics, and I'm just curious how you got interested into looking into it.
Well, my foray into medical ethics came by somewhat surprisingly to me, is that 50 years ago, I walked into the Philadelphia prison system, large jail, expecting to run an educational program, a literacy program, which I did do. But from that first day forward, I was stunned by the fact that the prison system, in fact, had been taken over by the University of Pennsylvania and a very prominent dermatologist, Albert Kligman, and turned into the largest human experimentation factory in America. This may come as a shock to a lot of people, which it certainly did me. But when I walked into that prison, I saw scores and scores of inmates wearing adhesive tape and bandages on their bodies. And I can show you and your audience what that was like. I'll put this up close to the screen, and this is the title, Acres of Skin, but I'm really showing it not to push the book sales, but to show you the inmate's back, which is covered with patches, adhesive tape. And this is what was going on throughout the Philadelphia prisons, the prisons being Holmesburg Prison, the House of Correction, and the detention center. These were three large penal institutions, the jail system of Philadelphia, which then was the third largest city in the nation. And to my great surprise, it had been captured or given away to the university to do medical trials. An incredible number of clinical trials were taking place in the prison on the cell blocks. And I had never spent any real time in a hospital setting or where a clinical trial was taking place. So I was absolutely stunned by it and could not explain it to myself, and was starting to have doubts, because when you're in a prison, which is a very, very rough, dangerous environment, loaded with felons, many convicted or charged with significant crimes, you start to see what looked like the walking wounded. And I thought to myself, it looked like they were in a knife fight on a cell block or a gang war in the prison yard. And I'm wondering if I should really be there, because I was, looking to help and educate some people, not to get carved up with somebody's shank. And the next day on A block, I asked the guard, "What's with all these guys with these wounds? Why are they all patched up with medical tape?" And the guard, John Reeves, just laughed at me, and chuckling, he said, "Oh, that's nothing. That's just a perfume test for the University of Pennsylvania." So I couldn't understand or believe what I was hearing, because the last place you would expect to see Arpège by Lanvin or Chanel or any other fancy perfume is in a prison where you have some, very smelly, dangerous inmates, hundreds of them, thousands of them. And I continued to pepper the guard with questions. Why are they doing it? Are they forced to do it? Do they make money? Do they get a reduced sentence? What are the repercussions? So forth and so on. And I just could not digest intellectually that perfumes being tested in a prison. And I continued to hit him with questions to finally he got bored or upset with all my questions. And he said, "Look, Mr. Hornblum, you wouldn't do it. I wouldn't do it. But these inmates are crazy. They're desperate for money. This is the only way to make a buck in the jail. So that's what they're doing. They sell a piece of their skin to make some money. That money they can use for the prison commissary, or they can send some money to their wives or girlfriends. Maybe if they make enough on enough experiments, they can pay their bail." So this was just stunning to me. And the guard went on to say, "Look, Mr. Hornblum, you wouldn't do it. I wouldn't do it. But these have been going on for 20 years. This has been going on for nearly a generation. And you're new in here, not these experiments. So cool it." And he advised me right then, and many other people would subsequently do the same, don't ask questions. Don't push your luck. If you start to make waves, you're going to be out of here. And that's what the atmosphere was, because prisons are paramilitary institutions. The guards are like soldiers, and they're told what to do when they do it. Very few questions are asked. I did ask questions. I couldn't digest it. And I asked questions about other things as well, because I tend to be very inquisitive and questioning. But it was, and this is another part of the story, which is important, how people in a major institution can fall in line and be part of something that's not quite legal or ethical and go along with it just because that's the way it's been done over the years. And it's something that when I give lectures at institutions, be they a community group or a historical association or a college, I tell the students or the med school, kids, check out what you're doing and be brave enough to ask some questions. And if something looks untoward to you, maybe it actually is and should not be going on. But this had been practiced in the Philly prison system from 1951. I walked into prison in 1971. So I was new. Everybody else had adopted the culture where inmates were there to use as raw material for experimentation. And I always expected that something unsavory was taking place, because you have to understand the atmosphere. The prison system was overwhelmingly minority. So I'm talking about 80 to 85% Black, 10 to 15% Puerto Rican, maybe 5 to 10% white. And the doctors were all white, all wearing white smocks, laboratory coats with PhD or MD after their name. And I just thought that was a very bad calculation taking place. You had inmates prone to bad behavior, not particularly bright, very few had a high school education, and even those who did have a degree were probably only on a ninth or 10th grade level. Many of them couldn't even read. So it was just a problematic atmosphere, which anybody would normally see in a prison. And then on top of it, you have this whole long lasting layer of medical research. So that was the atmosphere.
Now, when it came to the extent of what some of these experiments are, or what they would deem as research, I mean, did you look into what kind besides taking skin and cutting? I mean, that's horrible, but did you look into anything else of like, because I know about Whitey Bulger. I think recently in the last 7, 8 years, new documents were released that show that he was like, I guess people have wrote books that he was MK Ultra related, mostly because they coerced him. They told him, hey, we'll give you a lesser sentence if you let us try these drugs on you. And it's a crappy thing to do when someone's looking at 25 years and basically counting every minute, every hour, every day, trying to get out. Now you're coming at them saying, hey, we're going to try this new treatment out on you and you'll get a lesser sentence.
If anybody is really interested in that aspect, they can go to a library and pick up Acres of Skin, or dole out the few bucks to get a copy of it, because I have a whole chapter in there on the history of using prisoners as guinea pigs for medical experiments. One of the key outcomes for me, and your audience should be aware of, and this is something that the medical community is not particularly proud of and doesn't talk about it. It's basically the underbelly of American medicine. And that is, doctors and institutions knew where to go to test new elixirs, new designs that they hoped would thwart various medical conundrums. They needed a population that was human, that they could test their new concoctions on. They knew they couldn't do it to the Boston Philharmonic or the New York Philharmonic. They knew they couldn't use the city council of Albuquerque or Houston or whatever. So they went to institutions that basically held throwaway people. We're talking people who don't have influence, who don't have education, who don't have money, who don't have power. They're locked up generally. Many of them are not even compos mentis. They're in mental institutions. Some of them are even children, 4, 5, 6 years old. And that's where they went to do a lot of their experiments. Some of the top doctors that we revere now and are illuminated in various medical books with their triumphs rarely illuminate that the experiments took place on vulnerable populations that held people against their will, or were orphans, or young women without husbands or families or whatever, who were pregnant and so forth. And so prisons became one of the dominant go-to places for doctors who wanted to perform an experiment. At least half the states in America had at least one prison that was hosting human experiments. My own state of Pennsylvania probably led the way with close to a dozen institutions that were doing experiments. most of them in the Philadelphia area because of the University of Pennsylvania and Dr. Albert Kligman, who really is the Ayatollah of prison experimentation. I don't think there's any place else in the country during the 20th century that did more human experiments on more people for more years than what happened at Holmesburg and the other two prisons in Philly. So that's where doctors went, and they did everything from hair dyes to athlete's foot to eye drops to any sort of thing, including testing chocolate and its relationship to acne, as well as all sorts of phase 1 drug testing, which can be very dangerous. And then even further along, Kligman, who never said no to anybody who was proffering an experiment with money behind it, he was doing dioxin experiments for Dow Chemical. He was doing chemical warfare experiments for the US Army. He was doing tobacco experiments for tobacco companies in North Carolina. He did his own radioactive isotope experiments. I could go on and on. But he and Penn turned the Philly prison system into a supermarket of investigatory opportunity. Really, the Macy's of human experimentation, if you will, that anybody who wanted to test something on humans could come to Kligman, offer to pay for this particular piece of medical research. And Kligman, to my knowledge, never turned down anybody, even though these things were not only unsavory, but very dangerous. If you want, I'll give you an example of one in some depth, but I don't want to spend too long if
Sure,
you don't.
please do. I heard one that was pretty bad in the film that you made about a guy who tried out toothpaste and he lost all of his teeth by the age of 23. And it's just like,
Well, there are stories from the men who lost their hair or had problems with their gums. A case right now that I'm now your audience may not know, but it could be the same reason you reached out to me. The city of Philadelphia, for the first time in the nation's history, a city came out and apologized for allowing its prison system to be used for medical experimentation. They finally did an apology, and because it was so unique, it received a tremendous amount of coverage both here and abroad. It's been written about in the Daily Mail in England and about uh, the made Le Monde in France, and a French attorney who was already involved in litigation with the International Criminal Court has asked for my documentation and asked me to testify at The Hague regarding an ongoing suit they have concerning Agent Orange and the tremendous damage it did to the land and the people of Vietnam during the Vietnamese War, and the fact that many American soldiers were negatively impacted by it as well. But this French attorney learned in the Le Monde article that, as I wrote about in Acres of Skin, there was a situation in 1963 in Midland, Michigan, which is the home of Dow Chemical, whereby they had a significant problem on their hands. That was that a particular factory in their production plant making a herbicide, the workers were coming down with chloracne, a very nasty form of pimples and blackheads. It had risen to such a problem that the employees went on strike. And the union told their employer, Dow, not until you figure this out are we going to go back into that building. That building made a herbicide. They had buyers around the country that used the herbicide. So they can't get their product to market. They can't get their workers to come into the factory. And therefore, they tell their scientists, figure out what the hell the problem is and let's straighten it out. Let's fix it. Now, Dow, as you can imagine, big corporation, millions of dollars invested, been around a long time. They've got some competent people there. And the Dow scientists already have an idea what the problem is. The problem is a byproduct from the herbicide known as dioxin. And they know this stuff is really, really nasty, that it's toxic, probably carcinogenic. So they initiate their own experiments. They put dioxin on the ears of rabbits. And lo and behold, in a very short time, those rabbit ears come down with chloracne. So it confirms the view of the scientists, but Dow leadership want the real deal. What's the real deal? They want human results. So back in the 50s, the 60s, and the 70s, with all of these operations, public or private, when you want something tested that could cause a negative impact on the test subjects, possibly injuring them seriously or even killing them, where do you go? You go to Philly. Why do you go to Philly? Because Philly was known in the field of medical experimentation of having this particular dermatologist and university and prison system where all sorts of experiments from the innocuous to the truly dangerous were taking place. So because of Kligman, Penn, and Holmesburg, the Dow doctors and Dow corporate leaders reach out to Albert Kligman, this Penn dermatologist, and say that we have this situation underway. We're looking to discover the threshold dose of this chemical that causes a human reaction, a breakout reaction. So Kligman is intrigued by the problem. He's also enticed by the money that they are offering. An agreement quickly comes into place where Dow will send dioxin and a very conservative protocol to operationalize the experiment. When I say conservative, I don't mean that it's been endorsed by the Bush, Reagan, and Trump administration. I mean that those Dow scientists knew that dioxin was very dangerous, and even very small amounts could cause damage in humans. So they came up with a protocol that required Kligman to put very scant amounts on the test subjects who were prisoners. The prisoners, in fact, were never told what the experiment was. It was practice in the prison system to alleviate their fears by either denying or lying what was truly happening. So I never discovered any inmates in my years of interviewing them and tracking them down who believed they were involved in the dioxin experiments. And that was sort of the practice with a lot of this heavy stuff. Kligman calls out a dozen or two inmates because they were always volunteering, the inmates, because this is the way to make money. They were always hoping to make the most money and be in the least arena of danger. But it was a crapshoot because they never really knew for sure what they were getting involved with, the inmates. Kligman applies the dioxin as he's told in the protocol, and he waits a series of days or week or so, and to his great regret, there's no reaction. Kligman is a man of action, so he wants to see something happening, but it didn't. So he calls Verold Keith Rowe, the vice president at Dow at the time, who was his contact, expressing his sorrow and dismay that there was no reaction. But he says, let's, keep in touch. Let's go forward. Let's see what we can do, to help you out with your predicament. And Dal says, okay, we'll get back to you. Let us think about this. Dal does not know that Kligman on his own decides to jack up the dosage. He doesn't double it. He doesn't triple it. He doesn't quadruple it. In fact, he increases the dosage 475 times.
Is he just doing it for money? Is that the whole point, to get any reaction?
Money and his own intellectual curiosity. And so he puts far more of the dioxin on another group of inmates, in fact, a larger group. And lo and behold, the inmates break out in chloracne. So this is what Kligman wanted, a reaction, and he got it. It was his eureka moment. He calls up Verrill Keith Rowe, proclaiming, Eureka, we've got a reaction. The men have chloracne. When Rowe and the other Dal people hear what Kligman has done, they're absolutely stunned, because they never gave him another protocol. They didn't know that he was going to do it on his own, which he did do. They never would have increased the dosage to that level. And it shocked the hell out of them, to the point that they severed their relationship with Kligman. They couldn't believe, as Verrill Keith Rowe told me, that a significant researcher, an Ivy League esteemed professor, would do something so unscientific as jacking up the dosage to that height, to that level, and never telling the people who contracted him to do it.
Did he ever get a psych evaluation to see if he just got his rocks off on, just doing? I mean,
Well, that's another part of the story. These doctors did what they want, and the criminal justice community basically gave them a pass. They never, in my knowledge, in very few, if any cases, called these guys on the carpet, because they had that PhD or MD after the name, and Kligman had both. They sort of kowtowed to the men of science and the universities they came from and the connections they had. So there's another story in Acres of Skin that sort of gets into what you're asking with the FDA. But the point is, as far as I know, that particular experiment that went on in the mid 60s is the only time dioxin, which is the key ingredient of Agent Orange, was ever purposefully applied to humans, particularly Americans. Okay. And that's why this French attorney is anxious to get a hold of some of my documents and have me testify in The Hague that these experiments went on. The companies knew how dangerous it was, so forth and so on. So that was just one example. Kligman did many others, because he's in the prison system for nearly a quarter century, basically doing anything he wants without any sort of oversight. And it's part of the story, and a very sad and tragic one, that neither the medical community or the government or the prison system or the local politicians took any real interest in what the hell was happening on the cell blocks in American prisons. These were throwaway people. Who the hell cares about them? And the doctors had a field day, because they're inside a facility with high walls or razor wire fences. And those walls not only kept the inmates in, but they kept the public out. So it was a great place to do research, because no one on the outside, be it a row house resident or be it a journalist or be it an attorney, would ever really know what the hell's going on and how many people had been damaged in some sort of dangerous, unsavory way.
Did the company say no or cut off their relationship with him because of the aspect of like someone has an injury, you can pay them or you could do whatever to make that go away. But when it's a death, that's going to draw a lot of eyes in and they know what they're doing is unethical.
Well, it's part of that. They thought what Kligman had done was unethical. He never used that term with me, Verl Keithrow, but he basically voiced his shock and dismay that somebody of an elite caliber as Albert Kligman, who was internationally recognized as a groundbreaking uh, researcher in the field of medical experimentation, would do something as risky as what he did. So they probably were fearful that he could injure people, that some could die, and they ended their relationship, never learning what they did initially want to get at. And that was, what was the threshold dose? What was that lowest level of contact with dioxin that is going to injure an individual and cause a breakout in their skin? So that is a case where even the corporate community was shocked and turned off by Kligman's buccaneer approach to medical research.
When we talk about this dark side of like the medical community and what people refuse or just don't want to acknowledge, but it's factual and we know it's happening, but people just want to kind of gloss over it. Did any whistleblowers, any articles? I mean, who was the first person who blew the lid off of this whole thing where people started looking and paying attention to this? I mean, to the point now where you're
This
getting
is
apologies.
a story that I have written about, mostly in articles. May yet do a book on it down the line. But this is another very regrettable phenomenon, and that is the one where people who know something unsavory and unethical and dangerous is going on keep quiet about it. They don't ask questions, they don't raise their hand, they don't reach out, they don't speak up, and the practice continues to go on day after day, year after year in some cases. The best example of that is the notorious Tuskegee syphilis study. That experiment runs, and it's now the 90th anniversary of it. We're in the last day of October here. In October of 1932, the Tuskegee syphilis study gets underway in Macon County, Alabama, where they know hundreds of Black sharecroppers, unschooled, unsophisticated, have syphilis. The sharecroppers themselves don't know what they have. They think they have something that's known as bad blood, which is a catch-all term for a lot of different maladies. But they're incorporated into a large study by the US Public Health Service. And the experiment is not to hit them with any sort of suggested or revolutionary treatment, but basically to watch their physical demise. They will be brought in and what they called roundups once or twice a year. They will be monitored, they will be checked out, they will undergo some sophisticated observation. These men would never know what the hell's happening to them, but they knew that the doctors and the nurses were doing all sorts of testing. But it was really testing to see the progress of the disease. They never treated them. And this would go on and on year after year, where 399 men out of a total of 600 had syphilis, never given any sort of ameliorative treatment. And this whole phenomenon gets worse in the mid to late 40s when penicillin comes on hand, and it's proven to be a tremendous life-saving drug, a cure-all for a lot of different communicable diseases such as syphilis. But they are never given penicillin, and in fact, they are kept away from it. And in fact, doctors who may have had one of these men walk into their offices were criticized and lashed out at by significant medical organizations and communities if they found out they were treating these men with penicillin, because the whole object of the experiment was to watch the progress of the disease. And these men get sicker and sicker and eventually die off. That goes on for 40 years. 4 decades, that experiment goes on. It's written about in medical journals. There's at least 13 articles that come out on it. No one in the medical community blows a whistle on it. No one, be they a doctor or nurse, finds it unethical or immoral.
Well, it's not even that. They don't even talk about it today when it gets mentioned. The only issue I have with the Tuskegee syphilis experiments, besides what was going on, was the fact that people consider that the one time it happened and it's never happened since. Whenever I talk about Willowbrook State School, or I bring up another example,
Well, that you're bringing up the point I raised earlier, that the medical community is quite happy that so few people of the general public and even in the scientific professions know about the dark side of American medicine. I'll give you a perfect example. A number of years ago, I'm going to say at least a half dozen, maybe 10, I'm asked to give a talk at the Catholic Bioethics Institute at St. Joe's University in Philadelphia. And it's an evening event open to the public and the students. And there's a good turnout there of about 75, 80 people, maybe more. And I bring with me a former test subject, prisoner named Yusuf Anthony. And I wrote a book about him called Sentenced to Science. And he went through a hell of a lot of experiments that's really unbelievable. But after our talk, two gentlemen in suits come over to me and they ask me, what was this you're talking about, this Tuskegee event, this Tuskegee study? What I'm bringing out is two physicians in their 60s had never heard about the Tuskegee syphilis study. I had to educate them about it because I brought it up in my talk. So even people in the medical profession today don't even know about it, which is as sad a commentary as you can come up with. So this whole history of using vulnerable using vulnerable test subjects, people in institutions is generally unknown. So that when I give a talk on it, people blanch and they can't believe it happened. They think these things only happened in Nazi Germany.
yeah, that's what I don't like, is that it either gets labeled conspiracy or people just go, "We're not the Nazis. There's no way that could have happened." And it's
But
like,
if people doubt me, all they have to do is pick up one of my books and go into the index and look at the documentation. Many, if not all of these things are coming from medical journals where the experiment is articulated in very precise fashion. And then either at the beginning or at the end of these journal articles, the author of the article, the physician, normally thanks the superintendent of the Willowbrook State School or Holmesburg Prison or whatever for allowing us to use their inmates as trial subjects.
I mean, was it hard to find all the documentation? Like, did they keep a good log of it, or was a lot of it either
Who's
spoken or
they? When you
destroyed?
say they, who are you referring to?
Let's talk about what you wrote in Acres of Skin, like finding documentation for that.
Well, that book was a very, very long struggle. It took me 5 years. I even gave up my job in the Philadelphia Sheriff's Office. I gave up the job in '93. The book comes out in '98. It makes a significant impact. The allegations were so potent and controversial that it received coverage in the New York Times and many other newspapers, hundreds of newspapers. It's featured on Good Morning America. It's featured on the Evening News with Dan Rather, Terry Gross's Fresh Air. It has quite an impact because it's a story of a major city allowing prisoners to be used as guinea pigs, and that runs against the first principle of the Nuremberg Code that we and everybody else are supposed to be following. And that story shocked a lot of people. It got a lot of coverage. It's still getting coverage because of the recent apology by the city. But yes, it was hard getting the documentation. I spent a long time, 5 years, tracking down people, getting them to talk with me, doing these interviews. Oddly enough, the inmates, former inmates, were willing to talk, but didn't know what drug or concoction they had come in contact with. The doctors I tracked down knew what had been used, but were afraid to talk. So it was all fitting in very nicely as a hell of a mystery. And some would argue it's a murder mystery. It's the wholesale use of the bottom end of the American population by those at the top, the best of us using the least of us for their scientific pursuits.
The doctors that were or just didn't want to talk, was it because they afraid that they were going to have to pay like some type of price? I mean, there's no statute of limitations on murder if there was a possible death or anything of that sort. Or you just feel like they just didn't want to talk because they were just happy to be involved or something like
It
that.
was a combination of that and more. The doctors were embarrassed at the very least because they came from a day and age when you could routinely use devalued people as guinea pigs, but now time had moved on and it was considered less wonderful to risk people's health in experiments. Others were afraid they could be publicized in a very negative way. Others were afraid they'd be the target of lawsuits. I contacted some doctors who went into a panic and they said, I've been running from this for 20 years, 50 years, whatever. Other doctors said they wouldn't talk to me unless they had a lawyer presence. Other lawyers just cursed me up and hung up the phone. So it ran the gamut. But the vast majority of them, this was an event, a saga that they hoped would never be illuminated. And they hated me for delving into it. And I certainly understood that because what had been done, if not criminal, was certainly immoral and unethical. And it was done in a wholesale industrial scale level that cannot be matched by, I believe, any other institution or locale in the country, what happened in Philadelphia. Kligman really took the Philly prison system to a much higher level of infamy, to the point that there are many former inmate test subjects, as well as people who hear about it, who compare Kligman to Mengele and what the Nazi doctors were doing at Ravensbrück and Dachau and Auschwitz and things like that. The doctors generally were afraid to talk. The inmates were willing to talk, would recount how much they were paid, how they felt, what negative reactions they got, what they were told by the doctors. But it was clear they had no real understanding of what they had been exposed to. When I was in the prison system in the early 70s and then years later, I always expected there would be a journalist, a medical ethicist, a historian who would delve into this, because I knew from early on something is going on here that should not be happening. It never happened. And that mystery, that conundrum stayed with me in my different jobs over the years till finally in the 90s, I'm in the sheriff's office, still coming in contact with some of these former inmates I knew from decades prior. And my curiosity just got to me where I started pulling some of these inmates aside And some of them remembered me, and I had been involved in prison reform efforts over the years. So I had somewhat of a reputation with a lot of these men, and they would talk to me and they would point other inmates out to me and tell me to look up this person at Graterford or this person on the street, which I did do. I captured their accounts, their recollections, and little by little, so enveloped in the story with documents, the pursuit of documents, the pursuit of people who worked in the prison or know something about that arena, that I gave up my job and did a full court press using the Freedom of Information Act to get documents from the FDA, from the EPA, from the US Army, from the Department of Agriculture, so forth and so on, so that I had a, a massive collection of documentation to go along with the interviews. And that's why I've never been sued on a very controversial book, Acres of Skin, because I had done my homework. And it was the inmates who ended up suing the doctors and the prison system and the city and Penn because of what the book illuminated, how they were misused.
When I reached out to you, when I Googled your name, after I came across your book, it said a controversial author. And I go, what's controversial if you have the facts to back it up on it? It's a dark side that nobody wants to acknowledge. And I think it's important to ask questions. I think morally, it's not controversial at all. It's heading in the right direction when you're just trying to talk about proper ethics and
Well,
abuse rights.
whistleblowers and those who chronicle whistleblowers tend to be lumped as controversial authors because they're dealing with subjects that are controversial. To use people as a human guinea pig when you don't afford them the conventions of the time with regard to knowledge and good decision making and things like that. And I'll just, bring up once again the first principle of the Nuremberg Code. That code was written by American jurists at the trial of the Nazi doctors and what they did at the concentration camps. That first principle is generally known that the test subject has to have knowledge and give his consent that he's being used. That's a very short part of that first principle. The first principle goes on in a number of additional sentences to talk about having free will, free choice, be in an environment that's not coercive, that's not constrained. As I read it, if you are imprisoned, you no longer have free will. You can't walk out of there at any time and buy an apple taffy or a beer or a Coke or a hot dog. You can't go to visit anybody. You're locked up. You're in a cell. You don't have free will. You don't have free choice. And that's what the American jurists at the Nuremberg trials had in mind, that those people who were used as test subjects and guinea pigs were being used by the Nazis to test these new potions and thrown in ice vats and given typhoid and horrendous medical experiments, that you should not be used if you don't have free choice and free will and in a free atmosphere. But the American community after the war was able to rationalize that that Nuremberg Code was not for American doctors and American medicine, that it is for Nazis, Nazi doctors. And so after the Nuremberg Code is written and that war is over, that code is basically forgotten. It's not emphasized. It's not taught. It's not brought up. In my research over the years, and I'm probably one of the few people to have done it, I've tracked down and interviewed some very, very major American doctors, medical researchers who were all involved in groundbreaking work. Individuals like Albert Kligman, individuals like Chester Southman, individuals like John Ketchum, and others, and they all told me, and I really don't doubt them, that the Nuremberg Code was not mentioned in their medical education, that protecting test subjects was something that wasn't particularly emphasized or of importance back in the 40s and the 50s and even into the 60s. And that's why you had such a free atmosphere where doctors felt comfortable going to institutions that held the feeble-minded, as they were known then, and using children as young as 3, 4, 5, 6 years old for some really nasty experiments. These were throwaway individuals. They were that level between lab rats and humans, that level between dogs and monkeys and normal people. So a tremendous amount of that went on. It has not been written about. It has not been featured in newspaper articles or magazines or books. I have gone on to written 3 books that deal with it because there were very few, if anything, out there that really covered it. And there's probably other incidents out there, both here and abroad, that would probably shock the hell out of people if it was exposed and
Live
written
cancer
about.
cells getting injected into somebody, that gets chalked up as a conspiracy, but you mentioned it off air, and it's like, it's not just mental institutions, it's not just prisoners, it's senior living standards, it's a whole other slew of things. We don't know the extent because nobody wants to question.
As we were saying before you started the tape, there's a very famous case at the Jewish Chronic Disease Hospital in the early 60s in Brooklyn, where a famous doctor, Chester Southam, a cancer researcher at Sloan Kettering, gets the okay to go into the Jewish Chronic Disease Hospital and use elderly hospital patients as test subjects where they are injected with live cancer cells. This happens around 1963 in the largest, most sophisticated city in the country. And so if you told some people that that happened, true, they probably wouldn't believe you. But there's articles out on it. I've written some myself. You could go to the New York Post. I wrote an article. I can't recall the exact year. It must be within the last 6, 8 years that I did an account of the chronic disease hospital experiments where senior citizens, some of them who were either did not know English or were not particularly sane, were injected with cancer cells. So this is going on in the mid 60s in New York City. So yes, these things did happen, and the medical community is obviously embarrassed by it. They don't spend any time teaching it or informing students about it. Ethics, I have found, is still the caboose of the train. And I can tell you some interesting stories now where I've been invited to give some of my research and talk about my books at medical institutions or universities. And I'll go into a bookstore maybe to pat myself on the back. Maybe they'll have Acres of Skin, or maybe they'll have another one of my books. And in fact, they not only don't have any of my books, they don't have any ethics books. They'll have books on other facets of medicine, dealing with ophthalmology or dealing with, orthopedics or what have you, but no section on medical ethics. And that sort of tells you that field, the ethics of medicine, is still an orphan. It still doesn't get in the bookstore. It still is, not given emphasis in the medical curriculum. And so it's always a struggle to get things that impede progress in the minds of some doctors, and books that will educate you. They don't get into the bookstores or into the curriculum.
People wonder why I don't go to the doctor. Good God. Like, how do you have medical trust? That's why people are very skeptical when it comes to some medicine stuff. I mean, everyone
Well,
uses the
that that
example.
that that particularly affects the African American community because there have been many articles, and certainly more were written during the COVID pandemic, where blacks initially were one of the slowest groups to get the vaccine. And that hesitancy has its roots in things like Tuskegee and Holmesburg, where they have heard through the ages and over time by relatives to distrust doctors, distrust hospitals, and it still exists out there. It's just something that the medical community fostered. It wasn't their goal, but how they operated and what they did in turn cause many people, not only blacks, but others, to have some grave doubts and mistrust of the medical community.
This is just my one last question for you, but when it comes to the guy who acknowledged or apologized for the prison experiments, are they going to seek compensation? I mean, are there going to be articles of lawsuits that are going to you know, get these people the rightfully deserved things that they're entitled to for being improperly experimented on?
That question is still open. Right now, we are aggressively going after apologies from these organizations, be they private or public, be it a university or the city of Philadelphia. So Penn has apologized. The city, through the mayor, has apologized. City council has apologized. We're now looking at the College of Physicians and looking at the state legislature. The coalition that we put together is still debating the pros and cons of some sort of reparations or programmatic efforts that will build on the apology, moving towards some place where there can be a rebuilding of trust between, let's say, the Black community, the relatives of those who were used, and these institutions that are still around and still very strong. So that question is not answered. It's not resolved yet, but we are thinking about it.
Well, is there a place where people can find your books and any other links you would like to promote? I really
Well,
appreciate the
there
time you gave me.
are the bookstores have Acres of Skin, Sentenced to Science Against Their Will. You can go to Amazon. You can just do a little bit of a hunt yourself, and you'll be able to find them on the web, or you go to a bookstore. If they don't have it, they'll certainly order it. But there's a lot there to digest. I'm sure a lot of people will be shocked by it. I'm sure a lot of people will be stunned to hear this went on in America. An awful lot of folks think these things only happened under Hitler and Nazi held concentration camps. But in fact, medical research takes place around the world. And what is always interesting when I hear about it, because I've had a number of these experiences either here or abroad, such as where I was asked to give a talk at Penn State University to a group of visiting Dutch academics. They were visiting American campuses, and the Penn State professor asked me to come in and give a talk on my Acres of Skin research. And these Dutch academics were stunned because, in their mind, this was truly unexpected to hear that in American cities and universities we're doing experiments on incarcerated people, because it was America that delivered the Nuremberg Code at the trial of the Nazi doctors. They took it for granted that we were following our own prescription, our own code. Those people in Europe closest to the Nazi trials did embrace the first, second, third, fifth, eighth, 10th principle of the Nuremberg Code. So they were stunned to hear that this sort of experiment went on in America in contestation of what we were telling the rest of the world to do in Nazi Germany. As I say in my lectures, it's almost as if that code that was crafted by Americans in Nuremberg was placed on a ship in Rotterdam, sent to America, but before it got here, it sank because no one really embraced it. It was considered antithetical to American goals and interests. They thought, the American doctors and researchers thought, it would hamstring and hinder their progress. And so they didn't abide by it. And when you don't abide by something, when you don't follow the rules, when there are no ethical guardrails, individuals arise like Albert Kligman who feel they can do anything. And he did do anything.
I'm glad there's people out there like you that are actually researching and investigating it, at least talking about it as well too. I mean, this needs to be told to a lot more people. Like you said, a lot of people are going to be shocked when they come across some of your books and see some of the stuff you wrote about. And it's information that should be more publicly available, at least when it comes to just being taught or spoken about more in conversation. I mean, we need to acknowledge a lot of this stuff as well too. So I'm happy that someone like you's asking questions and doing the investigative research.
Well, there are some schools. Recently, myself and Adrienne Jones Alston, who was the daughter of a former prison activist and test subject, we were invited down to a college in Virginia called Germanna, and they hosted us, and they had us on radio, and we talked to the students, and they were stunned by the story, and they were so interested in it that they put a busload of their students at Germanna on a trip up to Philadelphia when we had an event outside Holmesburg Prison. And so, some people can get motivated and get involved, and you can look up the name Adrienne Jones Alston on the web and some of the activities she's doing. You can invite her, you can invite myself, you can look up the books. But this is the dark side of American medical research that more people should know about, but very few do. And when they do learn of it, they either poo-poo it as being, as you said, a conspiracy theory with new roots in reality, or so stunned they can't believe that something like this went on in the country, the land of the free and the home of the brave. But in fact, it's well documented. It did go on. And I've brought a number of these former test subjects with me when I've given talks at different universities and institutions.
Well, I'm going to link all your links in the description. Alan, it's been a serious pleasure being able to speak with you, and thank you for educating me and also my audience.